Okay, Be'ez Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zevachim Daf Mem Gimel, and we're going to just start from the Mishnah. Okay, so basically there's just a basic rule over here. Pigel, we know what pigel is. Pigel is, let's say you do one of the four avodas, one of the four main services to a carbon, which is Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, or Zrika. You do one of that and you think Chutz Lizmanai. Let's say Chutz Lizmanai, which means that you think about that you're going to eat the carbon after its time, after the time period. You're going to eat it next week. Or you're going to be maktir the Amorim, which is basically the food that's supposed to be given to God. And you're saying to yourself, I'm going to maktir the Amorim at a much later date. So then you passel the carbon so that if someone would eat the meat of the carbon, he would get karis. That we learned. That's called pigel. But we also learned that there's some things that are not pigel. Let's say the meat of the animal becomes pigel, but what about the hooves, the horns? They're not pigel. They're not edible food. Now we're going to learn something else. That what makes the meat and the amorim. Amorim is the stuff that's supposed to be eaten by God, which is the fats of the carbon, supposed to be brought in the mizbeach. If it's pigel and a human eats it, he gets karas. What makes those things karas? What makes the meat karas? It's because it had a dover hamatir, which means it had, in order for it to become edible for a human being to eat from the carbon, or from God to eat from the carbon, so to speak, that it should be makter on the mizbeach, you had to have a matir called a zrika. The zrika, the sprinkling of the blood, the sprinkling of the blood makes the carbon so that you can eat from the meat and you bring from the amorim on the mizbeach. That's clear. Hi, Lewis, we just began. Mishnah on Membeza Medbeis. So now comes along the Mishnah and says there are certain things that by itself in nature it is the matter. It is not that it becomes edible because something else happened to it. It itself makes other things edible. So then that thing never becomes pigel. So listen to what the Mishnah says. The following things, if you eat them, even though the rest of the carbon is pigel, this will not be pigel. HaKoimitz. What's the koimitz? We saw already. You take this thing that you put into, the kohen puts it into this klisharis with the frankincense, that's called the levina, and throws it onto the mizbeach. So let's say when he did the kmitza, he was thinking a bad thought of chutz lizmanoi. So then it can never become something that's osir of pigel itself. The rest of the mincha becomes osir and pigel. This, what's in this bowl, does not become osir and pigel if you brought it on the mizbeach, let's say, and then you took it off and want to eat it. You're not going to be chayiv pigel, even though the rest of the mincha is pigel. Ha-koimitz, the koimitz, va-k'toiris, va-halavayna. Lavayna goes together with the kmitza. K'toiris, we know what k'toiris are. It's the spices that you bring on the mizbeach ha-pnimi. So let's say as he's bringing it into the mizbeach ha-pnimi, he has a thought of chutz lizmanoi. He says, you know what, I'm going to bring this k'toiris, in 2 weeks from now. So then the k'toiris itself will not become pigel, so that if you eat the kataris, I guess this kataris is edible somewhat. If you eat it, you don't get karis. We go to Amid Aleph. Well, minchas kahanim. Mincha kahanim is the kohen. If a kohen decides he wants to gift the mincha to the Eibishter, so the whole flour is brought on the mizbeach, and there's no kmitza done. So it's not edible. It's never edible for a human. It's totally thrown on the mizbeach. So therefore, it's not something that has a matir to it, and therefore there's no pigel to it. Minchas kohen Mashiach, the same thing. Kohen Mashiach also, whatever the kohen gadol brings a mincha, the one that he does daily, it also is not going to have the din of pigel on it. V'hadam, okay. Here's a good example. I shech the carbon, right, and then I had a big chitzlus manai thought by the shechita. So the carbon is pigel. I do the Kabbalah, Halacha, and put the sprinkle of the blood on the Mizbeach, so the carbon is pigel, the meat is pigel. What happens if I lick the blood off the Mizbeach? Did I get, obviously you're not allowed to eat the blood, but let's say I did it by mistake. So um, do I get the Isser of pigel also, right? And I have to have two carbons, one for eating blood and one for eating pigel. The answer is no. The blood can never become pigel. The blood can never become pigel. It's the meat that becomes pigel. V'hanesochim, haboyim b'fnei atzman divrei mer. Nesochim, every carbon, besides bringing an animal, you also brought a flour and some wine. So to speak, like it's a way to remember it, you're giving God to eat a little bit of your carbon on the meat, and you're giving him a little flour and wine. And wine. Yes. So if you give that to the kohen, if you give that, um that can never become uh pigel. The minchas nesachim. And Rab Meir says haboyim b'fnei atzma. The key is that if you bring the minchas nesachim, not at the time that you bring the carbon, but you bring it like 2 days later, because we're going to learn that you don't have to bring the minchas nesachim right then and there. You can bring it a day or two after you brought your carbon. So only then is the nesachim cannot become pigel, because you're bringing it as a separate entity. Chacham says, Af haboim im behema. Even if you're bringing it right by the carbon, when you're bringing the carbon, you do the zrika, then you do the maktaras emerim, and then you would bring the nesachim, makter the nesachim on the mizbeach. Even then, Chachamim say that it could become pigel. It could become pigel. It could become pigel at that time, even though technically you could bring it. You can bring it as it cannot become pigel. Chachamim says nesachim can never become pigel. Next thing, luk shel shemen shemitzara. The luk shemen of a mitzara, the oil that's supposed to be sprinkled on the ear of the mitzara, and the Torah tells us to first sprinkle the blood of the asham onto the mitzara, and then put the oil on the mitzara, of the oil onto his earlobe. Right? You put first the blood on his earlobe, thumb, and right toe. So same thing, you put the oil following that. And the rest of the oil is eaten by the kahana. So if it can never become pigel, the oil can never become pigel. That's what the chachamim. That's what Rab Shimon says. Ein chayavim eleh mishum pigel. It can never become pigel, even though technically it has a matir. The only way you put the oil on the mitzvah is only after you put the dam on the mitzvah. Nevertheless, the oil, since it's not necessary, since technically you could put the oil on the mitzvah a day or two later, so it's not dependent on the blood being on his earlobe. So therefore, Rab Shimon says you're not chayv pigel. Rab Meir says if you're bringing it on the same time that you're bringing the asham, then the oil could become pigel. Chayavin alemishim pigel. Then the oil could become pigel. Shedam ha'ashim matiroi. Because first you're going to put the blood, and then only then you're allowed to put the oil. So what permits you to put the oil onto the mitzvah? The blood of the asham. Once you first put the blood of the asham, so that is like it's something that precedes it. That's matter you to do work with it. Because of that, Rabbi Meir will say that it can become pigel. Now the mitzvah switches the gears to the opposite way. If it has something that makes it permitted, whether it's food for the adam and food for mizbeach, then you chay pigel. For example, a regular carbon. What makes me allowed to eat the meat of my carbon shlamim after I sprinkle them as blood on the mizbeach? So it has something that's matter it. So that meat that I eat could potentially be a pigel. Bein lemizbeach. Or what makes me allowed to put amorim on the mizbeach only after you do zrika? So therefore, if I would eat the amorim, I would be chayiv pigel if it's a pigel carbon. Says the Mishnah, ha'oila, a carbon oila, dama mater, the blood sprinkling of the dam is the mater, as besar That permits you to bring the whole carbon onto the mizbeach. So therefore, the meat could become pigel. V'oira lekahanim, and it allows the skin of the animal go to the kahanim. Oilas oif, the oilas oif, doma mates besar lemezbeach. When you bring an oilas and oif, right? So this is how an oilas and oif, you squeeze the blood against the wall of the mizbeach. Well, that allows you. What does that allows you to bring to put the rest of the bird onto the mizbeach? So therefore, the meat of the bird can become pigel. Chata sa'oif, the chata sa'oif, doma matir as basar lekahanim. A chata sa'oif is a bird that you bring sometimes. You sprinkle it on the mizbeach, and then you squeeze it against the wall of the mizbeach. That's by a chata sa'oif. So those two things, once you do that, the meat of that bird can be eaten by the kahanim. So therefore, it could become pigel. Okay, basically, meat of a korban could become pigel. As we learned, the hoof of a korban cannot become pigel, or the horns of a korban can't become pigel, but the blood itself of a korban cannot become pigel. Things that don't have something that's mater it does not, or it itself is a mater, cannot become pigel. Let's say you have parim hanisrafim, mesirim hanisrafim, the parim that are burnt outside the base of Migdash, and the goats that are burnt outside of Mizbeach, like a par helam davar shel tzibor, a sirei abai dizchavim, or all the carbonas that the Kohen Gadol brought on Yom Kippur. So, dam and mater, the fact that the Kohen Gadol needs to sprinkle the blood inside the sanctuary, inside the Kodesh Kodashim by Yom Kippur. So therefore, that allowed you to put the rest of the fats as Amorim, the karav, to be brought on the Mizbeach. So therefore, the Amorim could become pigel. So if someone would eat the Amorim, he would be chayiv of pigel if it's a pigel type korban. Rab Shimon says like this: no, kol she'ena al mizbeach hachitzin k'shlamim. Anything that's not sprinkled on the mizbeach hachitzin like a shlamim, ein chayavim allow mishum pigel. You're not chayiv. It doesn't become pigel. It can become pasul, but it doesn't become that isser pigel. Remember, there are two things. A korban could become pasul, and if you eat a pasul a korban, you get a lav. But if you eat a pigel korban, the Torah was strict. A person could die with karis. So Rav Shimon says a korban that is sprinkled inside the sanctuary, it's not sprinkled on the outside mizbeach, cannot be included in the Aveira pigel, because the example that the Torah gave about pigel was a shlamim, which is a type of korban that's only sprinkled on the outside mizbeach. Says the Gemara, Amo Ula. Ula said, Koimitz pigel shehelu al gaba mizbeach. A koimitz, which is pigel. Let's say the kohen did in this bowl. He did the kamitza, put it into the bowl, but he made it pigel by thinking a chutz lizmani thought. Ula says a strange thing. As soon as he puts it on the mizbeach, paka pigula mimena. It's not pigel anymore. And then Ula says, pigel, if it brings the rest of the mincha to pigel, hu atzmei leikoshkein, certainly it should be pigel. So Ula seems to contradict himself from one second to another. First he says, if you take the kaimitz and put it on the mizbeach, it's not pigel anymore. And then he says, well, it should be pigel because it's making the rest of the mincha pigel. So the Gemara says, "My kamar." What is Ula saying? Answers the Gemara, "Hachi kamar." This is what Ula is saying. If it's not accepted on the mizbeach, right? If you don't throw it onto the mizbeach, if it's like totally worthless when you throw it on the mizbeach, how does it bring the rest of the mincha to pigel? So it must be something when you throw it on the mizbeach. But it itself is not pigel. It's a funny thing. The kmitza, as soon as you throw it onto the mizbeach, makes the rest of the flour, the rest of the mincha, a pigel mincha, right? Because if you did the avodah of the kmitza with a chitz lizmane thought, so it's pigel. But you need to throw it onto the mizbeach. But it itself is not pigel, but it can make the mincha pigel. Says the Gemara, the rest of the mincha pigel. So the Gemara says, "My kamashmalan." What is Ula trying to tell you? If he's trying to tell you that if you ran to the Mizbeach and pulled the Kmitza off the Mizbeach and ate it, you're not chayav pigel. Tanina, that is our Mishnah. Elu dvarim she'ein chayavim alei mishum pigel. The following things, pigel doesn't apply to them. And the first example the Mishnah says, ha-koimitz. The koimitz, aktaris, lavayna, minchas kam, minchas kam mashiach, minchas nesachim adam, all these things, the koimitz is not, it doesn't pigel. Even though the rest of the minchas pigel, the kamitz itself that's on the mizbeach is not pigel. So what is Ula trying to tell you? Ula is trying to tell you is when you make this kamitza, a pigel kamitza, let's say, with the wrong kavana, you're not supposed to throw it onto mizbeach. But what Ula is telling you is, di'im alu, if you did throw it on the mizbeach, lo yerdu, don't take it down. So if that's what Ula is trying to tell you, that's also, Tanina, we learned that a pigel thing, don't throw it on the mizbeach. But if you did, don't bring it down. That's also Mishnah. Halon v'yoytze atame v'shenichrat chutz l'zmanei, an animal that was geshachten chutz l'zmanei, which means the animal's pigel, basically. Don't bring it on the mizbeach. Chutz l'mekayme. Im alu, don't bring the fats on the mizbeach. But if you did bring it on, lo yerdu, don't take it down. So is that Ula teaching you that if you threw the kaimitz on the mizbeach, don't bring it down? Ve'ela, maybe Ula is trying to tell you, the im yardu, if they fell off the mizbeach, yalu, you could bring them up. Maybe the Ula is telling you the opposite. The pigel, the kaimitz, belongs on the mizbeach. And so that if it accidentally falls off the mizbeach, put it back into the fire of the mizbeach. Says the Gemara, Hanami Tanina. That we also learned. Kashem shem lo yerdu, kach im yardu lo yalov. Just the opposite. We learned the opposite. That's not the halacha. That if it falls off the mizbeach, lo yalo, don't bring it up. So what is Yula saying? Dim yardu yalo, if they fell off the mizbeach, yalo, bring it back onto the mizbeach. That's keneged the Mishnah. As the Gemara Litzricha, Yula is saying something different. You threw the kmitza on the mizbeach, and then you can see it got singed a little bit. Shemash lebehen ur, the fire started burning the kmitza, and then it fell off. So once the fire started burning the kmitza, it's like God started eating it already. So it's God's bread. So there, Ula says that if it fell off the mizbeach, you put it back on. Says the Gemara, if that's the chiddush of Ula, Hanami Amra, that's Ula. Ula Chadazimna. Ula said that once before. The Amma Ula said, Loishan, it wasn't taught that you don't put anything back on the mizbeach if it fell off the mizbeach. If fire did not singe it, but if fire did singe it, yalo, you put it back on the mizbeach. So already Ula said this once before. So what is he teaching you? That the kamitza also, once it got singed, it's like God's bread already, and therefore if it falls off, the mizbeach, you put it back on. Of course, Ula taught that to us once before. And says the Gemara, Ula had to teach it to you again by flour. Because Ma'u the same, I would have thought, Hanim Ilu, when would you say that you put a something that was on the Mizbeach, it got singed, it burnt, and now it fell off the Mizbeach, you put it back on the Mizbeach. That was only said, we go to Amid Beis, by Aver, the Mechaber, one limb, a limb of an animal, then since the fire singed it, and it's one piece, it's God's food, so to speak. Ava koimitz, but flour, the mifras, it's made up of a bunch of particles. A maloi, I might think that if part of the flour fell off the mizbeach, right? Let's say you see the white flour on the roof of the mizbeach, don't put it back in the fire. A maloi, kamash milon, we say that since you already put it on the fire, part of the kmitza was burnt, so it's considered as one glob, and therefore, if part of it fell off unsinged, you put it back on to the mizbeach. Amar Rav Acha even says a bigger chiddush. Hilkach, therefore, high koimitz pigel, a koimitz of pigel. The palga mochas a'aro, palga aska amaracha. Let's say you put half of it, you split it in half you put onto the fire on the mizbeach, and half was still on the ground. Umash lebehen ur, and fire singed the part that was on the ma'aracha. So masikna lekula lechatchila. Then you can bring the rest of them back up. You could bring the other half, which was never on the mizbeach, back onto the Mizbeach. And that's a bigger chiddush. It was never even on the Mizbeach, but since part of this kmitza was singed, so it's like God's food already, so even what's on the ground that was never brought onto the Mizbeach could be brought onto the Mizbeach. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yitzchak said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ha-pigel v'ha-noiser v'ha-tamei. Let's say you have a pigel, a noiser, and tamei, shehelen agam. Let's say a piece of meat that's tamei, and we're going to focus on tamei, that you brought it onto the mizbeach. Paka isa mehen. Then it's no more tamei anymore, such that let's say the meat got spit out from the fire, and you eat it, you didn't get an avera of eating tame. If the meat was tame, eating kachim that's tame, because it's like a mikvah for the piece of meat. Normally, if a piece of meat goes into a mikvah, a piece of meat that's tame goes into a mikvah, it doesn't become tahar. But here, Rabbi Yochanan said a chiddush that if a tame piece of kachim meat went onto the mizbeach, pake isur mehen, it's no more tame. So the Gemara says, "Oh my Eibishter, oh my God!" Like that's the expression. Mizbeach mikvah tahara, is the mizbeach a mikvah that could be mitahar the meat from being tamei? Or Rab Zera says yes. Shemash lebhed or once the fire started singeing it, so then it's like it all of a sudden the tumah disappears of this piece of kachim. Says the Gemara, is that true? That kachim piece of meat that went onto the mizbeach, the tumah can disappear. Masav Rav Yitzchak bar Bisnus, Rav Yitzchak bar Misna asked a question. We learned in a brisa, there is a pasuk that says, a cryptic pasuk. I'll quote it over here. Let's read this pasuk over here. The middle pasuk. V'hanefesh asher toichal basa mizevach hashlamim hashlashem. A person, nefesh means a human being, that eats the meat of a shlamim, v'tumasai alav, and he had tumah on him. He gets karas. What does that mean? That who had tame? Was the meat tame or was the person tame? We don't know. The pasuk is a little cryptic. We're going to darshan that this was saying that the person was tame, not the meat was tame. Because if the meat is tame, you get a lav, but if the person's tame, you get karas. Now, how do I know that this pasuk is talking about when the person is tame? So Acherim explained that. Acherim oimim, because the pasuk says, we go back into the Gemara, the tumasai alav. The tumah was on the human being. Misha tuma parachas mimenu. It must be a talking about a human being where the tumah can eventually separate from the person. He goes to the mikveh, the tumah disappears. But Yatsa Basa cannot be talking about a piece of meat. She'ain tumasei parachas memenu. A piece of meat, once it's tamei, the tumah can never disappear from that piece of meat. Then Isa, if it's true what Rabbi Yochanan said, hare tumah parachas memenu al yadehu ur. But tumah could disappear from a piece of meat if you put it onto the fire of the base of the mizbeach. Is that so? We see that this Acherim disagreed. It must be that tumah of a piece of meat can never disappear. Amar Rava said no. What they meant is yes, a tumah on a piece of meat can disappear, but not through a mikvah. But what makes a human different is al yedei mikvah kamrinim, because a human's tumah could disappear via a mikvah. Says the Gemara, midei mikvah kasiv. What does the pasuk say? Mikvah. The pasuk says the tumasai alav. The tumah was on it at that time. So it could be referring to a piece of meat. It could be referring to a human being. Both items have a tumah that could eventually disappear. A human could go to the mikvah. A piece of meat could be thrown onto the mizbeach, and the tumah would disappear. So how does the Acherim prove that it's talking about where the human was tamei? Papa says, because that pasuk is talking about the meat of a shlamim, and the meat of a shlamim is never put on the mizbeach, right? If you look at the pasuk says, hashlamim. So that meat is never put on the mizbeach. Therefore, that tumah can never disappear. So the tumasaya love must be that the pasuk is discussing where the human was tamei. And therefore, that's a clear indication that I know that this pasuk is talking about where the human was tamei. Ravina says, "V'tumasay alav mishim tuma parachas mimenu kihu shahalem." Yatzabasa davar she'ein tuma parachas kishu shalem ela kishu chaser. That the reason that pasuk is talking about where the human was tamei is because the difference between a human is when he goes to the mikveh, he's still the same human. A piece of meat, if you throw it on the fire, albeit the tumah disappears, but the basa shrinks, it's burnt a little bit. So therefore, that's what it indicates that the pasuk is only talking about where the human became tamei. But bottom line is Rabbi Yochanan's statement still holds. If you take a kosher, you take a kosher meat that's tamei and throw it onto the mizbeach, all of a sudden the tumah disappears. Now let's just discuss this brayso and we'll end in a minute. Gufa. We're discussing this pasuk over here. Let me repeat the pasuk, a cryptic pasuk. How do you know that pasuk is discussing where the human himself is tamei? And therefore, if the human is tamei and eats kachim, he gets kares. Maybe it's talking about where the kachim is tamei and the human is tahar. So how do you know that? So we have different opinions. That pasuk is talking about where the person was tamei. Maybe the pasuk is only talking about when the meat was tamei. So the Gemara says, "Nemakam tumasay, v'nemalham tumasay olav boy, malahalam betumas haguf b'kasam medaber, avkam betumas hakuf hakasam medaber." There's a pasuk that has a similar word, tumasay boy, olav boy. And we have like Gzeir Shava. There, that's talking about where a human was tamei and walked into the base of Mingdash. And there, that pasuk clearly discusses where the human was tamei. So I'll make a Gzeir Shava that this pasuk also must be discussing where the human is tamei. Rabbi Yossi says, "Hoil v'nemer kachim b'loshen rabim, v'nemer tuma b'loshen yacheb, b'tuma saguf hakasim medaber." You see, if you look at the pasuk says a person that eats mizebach hashlamim, plural world. You see, shlamim is plural world. The tumasai, if it was the tumasai alav on it, would not is going on the shlamim, it should say the tumasai alehem, right? Because it's going on the shlamim. The shlamim was tamei. So since it reverts into the singular, it must be discussing where the human is tamei. Rebbe says va'achal b'tumas aguf hakasim dava. Rebbe says that this word va'achal, he ate, is talking about b'tumas aguf. Rebbe is saying that the next pasuk is talking about a tumas aguf, so this pasuk must be talking about a tumas aguf. The Gemara doesn't understand Rebbe, and we'll leave that for tomorrow. Okay, Acherim say the tumasai alav, misha tumasai parachas memeni. Yatzabasa shein tumarachasai parachas memeni, and that's where we'll stop. That the tumasai alav means that the tumah was on it right now, but it could potentially disappear. That's what the pasuk is saying. So it must be that the human was tamei because he could go to the mikveh, but not meat was tamei because the meat most of the times cannot go to the mikveh and the tumah disappears. So it must be that only, and here's the bottom line, only if a person is tamei and eats kachim, you get kares. But if the kachim is tamei and the person is tar, you'll only get a lav. And that's how we finalize that this pasuk is talking about where the human is tamei, and that's why you get kares. Okay, we'll stop right here.
Fair.
Okay.